Well, hello. Welcome to Henry George Day Devotional episode 36. Here we are, beginning week 8. What a great little tradition we've got going. We are in book 3, chapter 1, book 3, chapter 1. Uh-oh, did I list the... Oh, we're killing me. I'll have to deal with that later. The inquiry narrowed to the laws of distribution, necessary relation of these laws. I think we talked about the three factors of production and the return to each of them, wages to labor, rent to land, and interest to capital. Let's see what George has for us today. Now, all this is recognized in the standard works on political economy. Adam Smith well illustrates how wages and compensation for risk largely enter into profits. Wages enter into profits is this ambiguous or over. It's an unclear term. It conflates things. Pointing out how the large profits of apothecaries and small retail dealers are in reality wages for their labor and not interest on their capital, and how the great profits sometimes made in risky businesses such as smuggling and the lumber trade are really not compensations for risk, which in the long run reduce the returns to capital so used to the ordinary or below the ordinary rate. Um, uh, they're really but compensations for risk. Similar illustrations are given in most of the subsequent works. Yeah, that's why crime doesn't pay, because you're taking on a bunch of risk, so you are compensated for taking on that risk, but overall, the hourly rate is roughly the same as working a normal job. It's kind of interesting. Similar illustrations are given in most of the subsequent works, where profit is formally defined in its common sense, with perhaps the exclusion of rent. In all these works, the reader is told that profits are made up of three elements: wages of superintendence, compensation for risk, and interest or the return for the use of capital. Thus, neither in its common meaning nor in the meaning expressly assigned to it in the current political economy can profits have any place in the discussion of the distribution of wealth between the three factors of production, either in its common meaning or in the meaning expressly assigned to it. To talk about the distribution of wealth into rent, wages, and profits is like talking of the division of mankind into men, women, and human beings. Yet this, to the utter bewilderment of the reader, is what is done in all the standard works. After formally decomposing profits into wages and superintendence, compensation for risk, and interest, the net return for the use of capital, they proceed to treat of the distribution of wealth between the rent of land, the wages of labor, and the profits of capital. I doubt not that there are thousands of men who have vainly puzzled their brains over this confusion of terms, and abandoned the effort in despair, thinking that as the fault could not be in such great thinkers, it must be in their own stupidity. If it is any consolation to such men, they may turn to Buckle's History of Civilization and see how a man who certainly got a marvelously clear idea of what he read, and who had read carefully the principal economists from Smith down, was inextricably confused by this jumble of profits and interest. For Buckle, Volume 1, Chapter 2, and Notes, persistently speaks of the distribution of wealth into rent, wages, interest, and profits. Buckle wants it all. And this is not to be wondered at, for after formally decomposing profits into wages of superintendence, insurance, and interest, these economists, in assigning causes which fix the general rate of profit, speak of things which evidently affect only that part of profits which they have denominated interest, and then, in speaking of the rate of interest, either give the meaningless formula of supply and demand, or speak of causes which affect the compensation for risk, evidently using the word in its common sense and not in the economic sense which they have assigned to it, from which compensation for risk is eliminated, If the reader will take up John Stuart Mill's Principles of Political Economy and compare the chapters on profits, Book 11, Chapter 15, with the chapter on interest, Book 3, Chapter 23, he will see the confusion thus arising exemplified in the case of the most logical of English economists, in a more striking manner than I would like to characterize. Whoa, George is being nice. He's going easy on Mill, but apparently Mill got mixed up here too. Now, such men have not been led into confusion of thought without a cause. If they, one after another, have followed Dr. Adam Smith, as boys play Follow My Leader, jumping where he jumped and falling where he fell, it has been that there was a fence where he jumped and a hole where he fell. The difficulty from which this confusion has sprung is in the pre-accepted theory of wages. Ah, the old theory of wages that we dealt with back in Book 1, eh? Alright, George continues. For reasons which I have before assigned, it has seemed to them a self-evident truth that the wages of certain classes of laborers depended upon the ratio between capital and the number of laborers. But there are certain kinds of rewards for exertion to which this theory evidently will not apply, so the term wages has in use been contracted to include wages in the narrow common sense. This being the case, if the term interest were used as consistently with their definitions it should have been used, to represent the third part of the division of the produce, all rewards of personal exertion, save those of what are commonly called wage workers, would clearly have been left out. I got a little confused in that sentence, but I'm not going back. But by treating the division of wealth as between rent, wages, and profits, instead of between rent, wages, and interest, this difficulty is glossed over. All wages which will not fall under the pre-accepted law of wages being vaguely grouped under profits as wages of superintendence. Yeah, I just had this thought that listening to an audiobook of Progress and Poverty, I'm like, when I read it, I'm pretty sure I reread a bunch of stuff to get a clear sense of what he was saying because his language is confusing and his sentences are long. And if you're listening to it, and the person is just the reader is just reading the words and not pausing it. Even this format, I'm sure you guys get, just as the nature of like listening, you zone out. Even while reading, I zone out. I don't know. Everyone should listen to this whole series, and then everyone should buy the book and read the whole book, and then everyone should write a paper about it. Then we can all be Georgists. But really, I don't know. It's pretty simple. You just have to conceptualize the land as something very different than capital. It's something nobody made. It's something we all need. And it's something that the government protects the first conquerors who claim the land. And the government lets the first conquerors hold it forever. I don't think it's fundamentally much more than that. Anyway, but there's all this, economics theory built up that if you feel like digging through it, you can figure out where it went wrong. But anyway, Hahavi in the chat says we need pictures, graphs. That won't work for my Spotify listeners, Javi. I have like 6 maybe. I exaggerated. I believe I have 6 Spotify followers. Alright, let's get back to George. To read carefully what economists say about the distribution of wealth is to see that, though they correctly define it, wages, as they use it in this connection, is what logicians would call an undistributed term. It does not mean all wages, but only some wages. Viz. Never know how to read the viz. It just means for example, I think. I don't know. The wages of manual labor paid by an employer. Oh yeah, that's what the viz was for. Wages, as they use in the connection, is what logicians would call an undistributed term. It does not mean all wages, but only some wages. Viz. the wages of manual labor paid by an employer. Yeah, okay. So some economists talk about wages, but they secretly just mean manual labor, wages, manual labor. Other wages are thrown over with the return to capital and included under the term profits, and any clear distinction between the returns to capital and the returns to human exertion thus avoided. The fact is that the current political economy fails to give any clear and consistent account of the distribution of wealth. The law of rent is clearly stated, but it stands unrelated. The rest is a confused and incoherent jumble. Did I get mixed up if we've read about the law of rent yet? I don't think we have. I mean, yeah, I just get mixed up about what I've covered, what he's read in these first two things. Cause I'm also in a progress in poverty book reading club, but they're like, in chapter 8, and I've also read it before, so I sometimes forget what level of Georgist you guys are. So the law of rent is a really big deal, and we'll talk. I think he'll definitely talk about it a lot more, I think. All right, let's continue. The very arrangement of these works shows this confusion and inconclusiveness of thought. In no politico-economic treatise that I know of are these laws of distribution brought together, so that the reader can take them in at a glance and recognize their relation to each other. But what is said about each one is enveloped in a mass of political and moral reflections and dissertations, and the reason is not far to seek. To bring together the three laws of distribution as they are now taught is to show at a glance that they lack necessary relation. Ooh. You can't bring them all in the same room together because some of them are kind of the same thing. The laws of the distribution of wealth are obviously laws of proportion, and must be so related to each other that any two being given, the third may be inferred. If A plus B plus C equals the total, we can do some basic algebra. For to say that one of the three parts of a whole is increased or decreased is to say that one or both of the other parts is reversely decreased or increased. If Tom, Dick, and Harry are partners in business, the agreement which fixes the share of one in the profits must at the same time fix either the separate or the joint shares of the other two. To fix Tom's share at 40% is to leave but 60% to be divided between Dick and Harry. To fix Dick's share at 40% and Harry's share at 35% is to fix Tom's share at, Javi, what's the answer? Did you say 25%? But between the laws of the distribution of wealth, as laid down in the standard works, there is no such relation. If we fish them out and bring them together, we find them to be as follows. Wages are determined by the ratio between the amount of capital devoted to the payment and subsistence of labor and the number of laborers seeking employment. Rent is determined by the margin of cultivation, all lands yielding as rent that part of their produce which exceeds what an equal application of labor and capital could produce from the poorest land in use. Okay, that's the law of rent. I guess we did talk about it. Interest is determined by the equation between the demands of borrowers and the supply of capital offered by lenders. Or if we take what is given as the law of profits, it is determined by wages, falling as wages rise and rising as wages fall, or to use the phrase of Mill, by the cost of labor to the capitalist. The bringing together of these current statements of the laws of the distribution of wealth shows at a glance that they lack the relation to each other which the true laws of distribution must have. They do not correlate and coordinate. All right, everybody, what was the problem in the three? Hence, at least two of these three laws are either wrongly apprehended or wrongly stated. My bet is the law of rent is cool. He's cool with the law of rent. Javi asks, what is the poorest land in use, though? I mean, that's you just look around and you see whatever land is being used that is the cheapest. and that just becomes your poorest land. This tallies with what we have already seen, that the current apprehension of the law of wages and inferentially of the law of interest will not bear examination. I got it right, guys. I hope you did too. Let us then seek the true laws of the distribution of the produce of labor into wages, rent, and interest. The proof that we have found them will be in their correlation, that they meet and relate and mutually bound each other. Alright, I'm going to leave you there for today. Like, subscribe, share, and come back next time.